Every time you pull on a thread in religious history, you find the same thing underneath: an institution with power, a motive, and access to the text. And then the text changes. But what would a scripture look like if it bypassed all of that? A record that came out of the ground instead of a committee room. One that left before the corruption happened, and that we can actually test with evidence. That's what this episode is about. One of the most common things that I hear, especially in my comment section, is that there is absolutely zero evidence for the Book of Mormon. And this gets thrown at LDS members as if it legitimately ends the conversation. But I want to tackle that today. Not with a testimony, but with archaeology, manuscript scholarship, linguistics, and history. Now, before we start, yes, I am still sunburned or more sunburned or whatever you want to call it. If that's what you came here to comment about, great, that's fine. But more importantly, I want you to recognize that the scholars I'm going to cite today are primarily not LDS. Many of them are not even Christian. Emmanuel Tove, who has edited the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project, is an Orthodox Jew. Frank Moore Cross was at Harvard. Margaret Barker is a British Methodist, and Bart Ehrman is an agnostic. Now, Matt Roper is LDS, but I'll tell you when I'm citing him. Everyone else, just assume that they have no reason to be doing me any favors. So if your rebuttal requires these entire fields of scholarship to be wrong, then you're not making an evidential argument. And when we talk about evidence or lack of evidence for something, that's kind of important. Also, this is not an exhaustive list of evidence for the Book of Mormon. There's way more than I have time for in one video, but zero evidence is the claim that gets made constantly by people who haven't actually looked. So even if you reject all of my theological conclusions, you can't make that claim honestly anymore. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard. So what are we actually talking about? What is the Book of Mormon, and why does any of this matter? The Book of Mormon is a volume of scripture that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly called Mormons, accept as an authentic ancient record. According to the account, it was written by a series of prophets in the ancient Americas beginning around 600 BC, engraved on metal plates, buried in a hillside in what is now upstate New York, and translated by Joseph Smith in 1829 using divine means. It was published in 1830. Now, the critics claim that it's a 19th century total invention written by Joseph Smith himself. Obviously, we disagree. Now, the fraud theory has a specific prediction. If Joseph invented this, the text should reflect what a 19th century American with limited education had access to. It should contain the errors that you would expect from someone inventing an ancient record without actually knowing ancient history. And for a long time, the critics argued that's exactly what it contained: a list of anachronisms and historical impossibilities that proved it was fiction. But that list has been shrinking for 195 years. Matt Roper, now this is the LDS scholar, and I'm telling you up front, he went through every published criticism of the Book of Mormon's historical and archaeological claims since 1830, over 1,000 publications. His 2019 analysis found 141 out of 205 claimed anachronisms fully eliminated by subsequent research. Another 11% were trending toward elimination. And to be clear about what eliminated means here, it doesn't mean that LDS scholars argued back. It means that external archaeology, like non-LDS digs and secular published findings, confirmed that the thing critics called impossible actually existed in the ancient world. The eliminations came from outside, not from within. Usually, when a fraud gets scrutinized over 2 centuries, the problems multiply. When an authentic record faces scrutiny, the problems shrink. Critics still leading with the archaeology argument are working from a list that's 70% shorter than it used to be, and they get really quiet about the items that get crossed off. Now, the critics also say that Joseph just copied Isaiah from the King James Bible. Doesn't that settle the whole thing? The Book of Mormon does contain extensive Isaiah passages. Roughly a third of the book appears across several chapters. Critics will say that this proves Joseph Smith just stole it from the Bible on a shelf. But the problem is that if you actually compare the two side by side, you find hundreds of differences: word substitutions, phrase variations, structural changes, additions, and omissions. Not a handful, but hundreds. If you're fabricating an ancient record and need some Isaiah passages, you would probably just copy it word for word from the Bible that everyone knows. That's the path of least resistance. Making hundreds of small changes adds complexity and creates more opportunities to get caught. People committing fraud don't usually try to make their job harder on purpose. So if Joseph actually copied Isaiah, why does it look like he didn't? And before you try to say that he just varied it deliberately to make it look like a translation, that still doesn't explain the pattern of the variations. Random creative changes would scatter randomly, sure, but what we actually find is that the variations aren't random. They cluster in a specific direction, toward the older, more ancient readings, which is typical for what translation from an older source actually looks like. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are what confirm it. In 1947, archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran in Israel, with the oldest Isaiah manuscripts ever found, about 1,000 years older than what the King James translators worked from. When scholars compared those manuscripts to the King James Version, they found real distinguishable variants. So here's the issue for the fraud theory. Some of the Book of Mormon's variations from the King James Version match the Dead Sea Scrolls better than the King James Version does. The scrolls weren't discovered until 1947, so 117 years after the Book of Mormon was published. For the fraud theory to hold, Joseph would have needed to correctly guess which textual variants from manuscripts buried in desert caves represented the more accurate ancient readings, manuscripts that he would have had no way of knowing existed. Now, what if Joseph was just a gifted writer who was able to pull it off anyway? Okay, let's talk about the numbers. The Book of Mormon is 584 pages, over 269,000 words. Joseph dictated the entire thing out loud to a scribe in approximately 65 working days, with no notes, no manuscript, and no revisions. The witnesses described him as walking away for meals and then returning and picking up mid-sentence exactly where he left off. So 3,000 to 4,000 words per day with internal consistency across hundreds of named characters, locations, timelines, and theological arguments spanning 1,000 years of narrative. Professional authors with outlines and months of planning average around 1,000 words a day, and they get to edit for continuity. There's also the comprehensive stylometric analysis, the computational study of writing style, measuring vocabulary, sentence structure, syntax patterns, and word frequency. Stylometry finds the different books within the Book of Mormon to be inconsistent with a single author. To be clear, this isn't an LDS specific methodology. It's the same technique used to resolve the Shakespeare authorship debate, to correctly attribute disputed Federalist papers to Hamilton versus Madison, and to identify anonymous authors across centuries of literature. When applied to known authors, it works. The method correctly identifies who wrote what. When plotted on a three-dimensional authorship graph, the different books of the Book of Mormon scatter across completely different regions. Joseph Smith's own writings cluster in one place, but the Book of Mormon's books don't cluster with him or with each other. Also note that professional novelists who deliberately create different character voices still produce a very consistent stylometric fingerprint across all of their work. The Book of Mormon doesn't. But the most striking piece of authorship evidence to me is chiasmus, an ancient Hebrew literary device where ideas mirror around a central pivot point in an A, B, C, B, A structure, sometimes running 15 to 30 layers deep. Chiasmus wasn't recognized in Western scholarship until 1854, 24 years after the Book of Mormon was published, and it remained obscure for another century. In 1967, 138 years after publication, a BYU student named John Welch encountered chiasmus in New Testament scholarship in Germany. He returned to the Book of Mormon and found it embedded throughout the text. The most analyzed example is Alma chapter 36, a 17-layer structure with Alma's conversion at its center, Jesus Christ as the precise pivot point, and perfectly mirrored thematic elements running outward in both directions. Boyd Edwards and W. Farrell Edwards, two physicists, not LDS apologists, ran the statistical analysis on Alma 36 specifically and put the probability of that structure alone occurring by chance at between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in a million. To deliberately construct that while dictating without notes, you'd need to know what chiasmus was to begin with, and Joseph didn't. In fact, nobody did in America in 1829. He would have needed to hold the entire mirrored pattern in his head while simultaneously managing hundreds of characters and theological threads across a 269,000 word text that he was producing at 3,000 words a day. And he had to do it multiple times throughout the book. Critics analyzed the Book of Mormon for 138 years, looking specifically for evidence of fraud, and missed it entirely, because nobody knew about it, especially Joseph. Now, people really want to dig and they want to ask, is there any hard physical evidence, something that exists in the ground that supports the Book of Mormon? Well, the Nahom inscription is as hard as it gets. The Book of Mormon describes Lehi's family traveling south along the Arabian Peninsula from Jerusalem and then turning east. In that account, a man named Ishmael dies and is buried at a place called Nahom. Decades after the Book of Mormon was published, archaeologists excavating in Yemen discovered ancient stone altars bearing the inscription NHM, dating to the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the era when Lehi's journey would have taken place, located precisely where the ancient frankincense trail turned east toward the coast of Oman. There's also a burial stone from the region bearing the name Ishmael. One thing for anyone that doesn't read or write anything Semitic, ancient Semitic scripts like Hebrew, South Arabian, and Phoenician were consonantal, meaning that they wrote only in consonants, they didn't use vowels. So NHM in ancient South Arabian script is correctly vocalized as Nahom, and the modern Nahim tribal region in Yemen still bears those same three consonants today, continuously documented from antiquity. This isn't a stretch or an approximation. NHM is Nahom by the standard rules of how that script works, the same way any ancient Semitic place name is reconstructed from its consonantal root. Now, the Arabian Peninsula's trade routes and inscriptions were not mapped by Western scholars in 1829. So, there was no source Joseph could have consulted for where the frankincense trail turned east, what tribal names existed in that region in 600 BC, or what burial traditions were practiced there. Researchers have also since identified a location in Oman called Khor Kharfot, matching all 12 specific requirements that the Book of Mormon gives for the place called Bountiful. The place exists, the burial name exists, and both are confirmed by inscriptions found a century and a half after Joseph died. So, even granting all of that, why did the Book of Mormon need to exist? Why couldn't God just protect the Bible? I don't speak for God, and I won't try to tell you why he does things. But the Bible wasn't protected. And the first 10 episodes of this channel so far are about exactly that. Institutions that controlled the text changed the text. That's the whole argument. And the corruption that makes the Book of Mormon's existence necessary starts in 621 BC, exactly 21 years before Lehi left Jerusalem. In 621 BC, King Josiah launched what scholars call the Deuteronomistic Reform. His scribes purged the religious landscape of Israel. They edited scriptures, they destroyed altars, and they killed priests who practiced the old religion. What they were specifically eliminating included seeing God face to face, the divine council, messianic theology involving God in the flesh, and worship anywhere outside the Jerusalem temple. This is all documented in 2 King and established by Frank Moore at Harvard, Margaret Barker in Britain, and by Michael Heiser. This was a violent theological consolidation that suppressed an older tradition. It happened. Now, open 1 Nephi chapter 1. Lehi sees God on his throne, surrounded by a heavenly council. He prophesies about a Messiah coming in the flesh. Then he builds an altar in the wilderness. Critics point to all of this as being anachronistic, trying to claim that Jews in 600 BC didn't believe these things. But that's actually backwards. These were the things being eliminated at that precise moment. Lehi was practicing pre-reform theology at the moment that it became illegal. Laman and Lemuel's opposition to their father also makes sense in this context. They had been raised under the reform, and they knew what he was doing was dangerous. Now, a critic might also say, the Josiah reforms are right there in 2 Kings. Joseph could have just read that. And that's true. The narrative does exist in the Bible. But what Joseph Smith would have needed to know isn't just that Josiah reformed something. He would have needed to understand the full scope of the Deuteronomistic editorial program, that a specific school of scribes systematically and specifically suppressed divine council theology, pre-existent Messiah language, and open theophany across multiple biblical books over decades. But that is a 20th century scholarly framework developed by Martin Noth, Frank Moore, and others. It was not available in 1830. Reading 2 Kings tells you that Josiah burned some altars, but it doesn't tell you that Lehi's specific behavior in 1 Nephi maps precisely onto the theology being outlawed at that exact moment. That connection required a century of critical scholarship to establish. So, what does that mean for what the record actually preserved? It means that the Book of Mormon didn't escape the editing by accident. It left before the editors arrived. Lehi took the brass plates, which was scripture predating the Deuteronomistic revisions, out of Jerusalem just before Babylon destroyed the city, and the post-exilic reconstruction consolidated the new theological program. The record bypassed everything that followed: the Babylonian exile, the Masoretic standardization, the scribal copying chains, and the councils that voted on the canon. None of it touched the plates. What came out at the other end preserves a bold, embodied, pre-existent Christ. It preserves divine council imagery. It preserves open theophany, prophets seeing God face to face. And it preserves a Christology that the Dead Sea Scroll scholarship has confirmed was in circulation before the standardization period suppressed it. Joseph had no access to that scholarship because it didn't exist yet. The critical response here is then usually something like, well, he just unconsciously absorbed biblical patterns from his environment and reproduced them. But that argument really doesn't hold for one specific reason. The content in the Book of Mormon doesn't match the Bible Joseph had access to. It matches the pre-Masoretic tradition that was edited out of the Bible before the canon was finalized. You can't unconsciously absorb content that isn't in your source material. The Book of Mormon's theological fingerprint matches what the standardized Bible suppressed, not what it preserved. The simplest explanation for why ancient content that wasn't in Joseph's Bible is in the Book of Mormon is the explanation that the book itself gives. To sum it all up, what happens when human institutions get their hands on sacred texts? Editing happens. Theology gets flattened. Inconvenient content disappears. That's documented history, and most of it has been established by scholars with no reason to favor the LDS position. The Book of Mormon is our answer to that problem. A record that left before the corruption fully arrived, buried for over 1,000 years, published in 1830 when we had the printing press, and confirmed by evidence that postdates it, like Dead Sea Scroll variants it shouldn't know about, Nahom inscriptions it couldn't have predicted, stylometric patterns inconsistent with a single author, chiasmus undetected for 138 years, and Deuteronomistic Reform theology accurately depicted before the scholarship existed to even explain it. The trend line goes one direction, and it has for almost 200 years. If you're LDS and someone keeps saying that there's zero evidence, ask them to explain Nahom. Ask them about the Dead Sea Scrolls variants. Ask them about the Chiasmus timeline. The evidence is on your side, and this is just a taste. If you're skeptical, you should recognize that a text that keeps getting confirmed after almost 200 years of scrutiny deserves a serious look. I was an atheist for most of my life, and this is just some of the evidence that made me curious in the first place. I'm not asking for a faith commitment, just intellectual integrity. And if you're curious, LDS members believe that God pulled a record out of the transmission chain before the chain got compromised. That's what the Book of Mormon is. Whether you accept that or not, you now know that there is evidence. Now, we don't claim that the evidence proves the church. Conversion is a personal decision that goes far beyond any archaeological record. But the archaeological record is there, it's real, and it still matters. All of my sources are in the pinned comment below. See for yourself. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard.